when Thomas Ashford, a blacksmith's son from Somerset, who had never owned land or imagined he could, stood before the royal commissioner in June of 1352 and signed a contract granting him tenancy of 40 acres at a fixed rent with rights he'd never dreamed possible just 3 years earlier. He understood that he was witnessing not just his own good fortune, but the fundamental reorganization of English society in ways that would have been unthinkable before the plague had killed a third of the kingdom and forced the creation of new laws to govern new lives. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day, and if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Thomas was 24 years old, tall and strong from years of working at his father's forge, unmarried because as a younger son he'd had no prospects of inheriting land or establishing an independent household, expecting to remain a journeyman blacksmith for his entire life, working for wages when he could find employment, dependent on others for his survival and security. This had been the natural order of things, the way society worked, the future that young men in his position accepted because there was no alternative. But then the plague had come in the summer of 1348, had swept through Somerset like a scythe through wheat, had killed Thomas's father and 2 of his 3 brothers, had killed the lord of the manor and his eldest son, had killed perhaps half the population of the village where Thomas had been born and where he'd expected to die, having lived essentially the same life his ancestors had lived for generations beyond counting. The immediate aftermath had been chaos. Fields went unharvested because there weren't enough workers to bring in the grain. Animals wandered unfenced because the people who'd tended them were dead. Houses stood empty, workshops sat idle. The mechanisms of daily life that had seemed so permanent and reliable simply stopped functioning because the people who'd made them function were gone. Thomas had survived, he didn't know why, couldn't explain it, had been as exposed to the plague as anyone else but hadn't fallen ill, had watched people around him die while he remained healthy, and in the months after the dying finally slowed and then stopped, as the survivors began to assess what remained and what was needed, Thomas had discovered that his skills as a blacksmith were suddenly valuable in ways they'd never been before. There were far fewer blacksmiths now, and the ones who remained could demand wages that would have been unthinkable in the old world. Thomas found himself with more work than he could handle, with farmers and landowners desperate for his services, willing to pay rates that astonished him. For the first time in his life he had money beyond his immediate needs, had savings, had the material foundation that might allow him to think about marriage and establishing his own household. But he'd also noticed something else in the years after the plague land was available in ways it had never been before. The manor where Thomas lived had lost its lord and heir, had passed to a distant cousin who'd inherited multiple properties and who couldn't personally manage all of them. Fields that had been carefully cultivated for centuries lay empty because the families who'd worked them were dead, and there was no one to take their places under the old feudal arrangements, where land tenure was inherited and controlled by lords who had every incentive to maintain the traditional system. The traditional system, however, no longer worked. With half the population dead, lords couldn't find enough workers to farm their lands under the old terms of labor service and feudal obligation. They needed workers desperately, needed to get their fields cultivated and their rents collected. but they couldn't compel service from people who no longer existed or who could easily move to other manors where conditions were better. So the system began to change haltingly and unevenly at first, driven by the practical necessities of landowners who needed workers more than they needed to maintain traditional hierarchies. Lords began offering better terms to attract workers' reduced labor obligations, fixed money rents instead of labor service, longer lease terms, even the possibility of purchasing land outright. Workers, recognizing their new bargaining power, began demanding these better terms, moving from manor to manor seeking the best conditions, refusing to accept the old arrangements that had kept them bound to land and lords with no possibility of advancement. The English crown, watching these changes with alarm, had tried to stop them. In 1349, even before the plague had fully subsided, Parliament had passed the Ordinance of Labourers, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prevent workers from leaving their home, manors to seek better conditions elsewhere. The ordinance declared it illegal for workers to demand higher wages than they'd received before the plague, illegal for employers to offer such wages, illegal for workers to refuse work at the statutory rates. But the ordinance was largely unenforceable, and there were too few workers and too much demand for their labor, and the economic realities overwhelmed the legal prohibitions. Workers continued to demand higher wages. Employers continued to pay them because they had no choice, and the mobility of labor continued despite laws attempting to restrict it. The Crown had followed up in 1351 with the more comprehensive Statute of Laborers, strengthening the penalties and creating enforcement mechanisms, but this too proved inadequate against the fundamental economic pressures that the demographic collapse had created. Thomas had watched these legal and economic struggles with growing understanding that the world was changing in ways that created opportunities for people like him. He'd continued working as a blacksmith, accumulating savings, but he'd also been watching the land market, talking to other survivors about what was possible, learning that manors across Somerset and beyond were offering tenancies on terms that his father could never have obtained, that would allow him to combine blacksmith work with farming, to establish the kind of mixed livelihood that could support a family and create security. When he'd heard that the manor of Ashworth, not his home manor, but one about 10 miles distant, was offering tenancies on remarkably favorable terms to anyone willing to take up the substantial amounts of land that had been left vacant by plague deaths, Thomas had investigated. He'd ridden to Ashworth on a spring morning, had looked at the available land, had spoken with the steward who managed the property for an absentee lord, had learned the terms being offered. 40 acres of good land, a mixture of arable fields and pasture and woodland, a fixed money rent of 10 shillings per year, substantially below what such land would have commanded before the plague, a lease term of 21 years, renewable, the right to sublease portions of the land if he chose, the right to improvements, meaning anything he built or planted would belong to him, not revert to the lord, and most remarkably, a clause stating that if Thomas worked the land successfully for 10 years and kept up his rent payments, he would have the right to purchase the property outright for a sum that was stated in the contract and couldn't be increased. These terms were extraordinary, would have been impossible before the plague, when land was scarce and workers abundant, and lords could dictate terms without fear of losing tenants. But now, with land abundant and workers scarce, the power dynamic had reversed. Lords needed tenants, needed people willing to take up land and farm it and pay rent, and they were willing to offer terms that would have shocked their fathers and grandfathers. Thomas had negotiated carefully, had asked for and received even better terms, a reduction in the first year's rent to allow him to establish himself, the right to cut timber from the woodland for building, the assurance that the 21-year lease would be honored regardless of whether the current lord died or the property changed hands. The steward, desperate to get the land producing rent rather than lying fallow, had agreed to everything, and they'd signed the contract with Thomas, barely believing what he was committing to. Now, 2 months after signing, Thomas stood in the middle of his 40 acres, his land, the first member of his family to hold such property in anyone's memory, and he tried to absorb what this meant. He was no longer just a blacksmith working for wages. He was a farmer, a landholder, someone with property and a stake in the future, someone who could marry and expect to raise children who would have opportunities he'd never imagined for himself. The responsibility felt enormous. 40 acres was more land than one person could farm alone, which meant Thomas would need help-hired labor during busy seasons, perhaps eventually a permanent farmhand, a wife who could manage the household and help with lighter farm work. He'd also need to maintain his blacksmith business, because the farm's income alone wouldn't be sufficient, at least not in the early years before he'd fully established his operation. But the potential was real. If he worked hard, if he managed carefully, if the harvests were decent and prices remained reasonable, he could make this work. He could build a house on the land. There were ruins of the previous tenant's house, a family that had died entirely in the plague, and Thomas could use those foundations and salvage what materials remained while adding new construction. He could establish himself as a man of property, could attract a wife from a family that would have been above his station before, but which might now see him as an appropriate match. The plague had been catastrophic, had killed people Thomas loved, had destroyed the social order that had organized his world. But it had also created possibilities, had opened spaces for advancement that had been completely closed in the old system, had made it conceivable for a blacksmith's son to become a land-holding farmer with prospects for real prosperity. This was a transformation that the plague and the new laws and economic pressures had triggered. Not just death and disruption, but reorganization, the creation of new social arrangements that distributed land and opportunity more widely than the old feudal system had permitted. It wasn't intentional, wasn't the result of reformers trying to create a more just society. It was simply the practical response to demographic collapse, the way survivors adapted to the new reality of labor scarcity and land abundance. Thomas began the work of establishing his farm systematically, starting with the most essential tasks and working outward. First, he needed shelter. The ruins of the previous house provided a foundation and some salvageable timber, and Thomas used his metalworking skills to create the tools and fittings he needed, working evenings and Sundays to construct a modest but solid dwelling. It was smaller than he might eventually want, but it was weatherproof and adequate for a single man, expandable if and when he married. Next, he assessed the land itself, walking the 40 acres carefully, understanding what he had. Perhaps 25 acres were arable, suitable for growing grain and vegetables. 10 acres were pasture, good for grazing animals. 5 acres were woodland, useful for timber and fuel and pannage for pigs. The land had been worked before, showed evidence of the strip field system that had organized medieval agriculture, but 3 years of lying fallow had allowed some recovery of soil fertility, had let the land rest in ways that might actually benefit the first years of Thomas's cultivation. He decided on a mixed agricultural strategy. He would plant the best fields with wheat and barley, crops that could be sold for cash or used for household consumption. He would keep some animals, sheep primarily, as they required less daily labor than cattle, and their wool could provide additional income. He would maintain a large kitchen garden for household vegetables, and he would continue his blacksmith work, both because it provided immediate income while the farm was being established, and because it gave him a diversified livelihood that wouldn't be entirely dependent on agricultural success. This mixed strategy required careful time management. Thomas couldn't be in the forge and in the fields simultaneously, so he had to plan his blacksmith work around the agricultural calendar, concentrating metal work in the winter months when farm labor was minimal, reducing it during planting and harvest when the land demanded full attention. It was a juggling act, a constant negotiation between competing demands, but Thomas found he thrived on the challenge, appreciated the variety, enjoyed using both his physical strength and his technical skills. He hired temporary workers during the busiest seasons, local men who were also trying to establish themselves in the changed post-plague economy, who were willing to work for wages that were higher than traditional rates, but which both parties understood were the new normal. Thomas paid fairly, treated his workers well, and as a result had a reliable labor pool when he needed it. By the autumn of 1352, Thomas had his first harvest from his own land. The yields were modest. He'd only planted about 15 acres, hadn't pushed too hard in this first year, while he was still learning the land and establishing his systems. But the grain was good quality, and when he sold his surplus at the market in the nearby town, he made enough to pay his rent, cover his expenses, and still have a small profit. More importantly, the process had worked. He'd successfully combined blacksmith work and farming, had managed both without either suffering excessively. The farm was established, the house was built, the basic infrastructure was in place. He'd proven to himself and to the manor steward that he was a viable tenant, someone who could work the land productively and meet his obligations. With this foundation established, Thomas began to think seriously about marriage. He was now 25, established in property, with a house and land and prospects. These were the qualifications that made a man marriageable, that allowed him to approach families with daughters and present himself as a suitable husband. There was a woman he'd noticed in the market town where he sold his grain and did some of his blacksmith work. Her name was Alice. She was perhaps 21 or 22, the daughter of a merchant who'd survived the plague, but whose business had struggled in the aftermath as trade patterns were disrupted. Thomas had spoken with her a few times, brief conversations about grain prices or tools he'd made. Nothing romantic, but enough to establish that she was intelligent and capable, and had the kind of practical competence that would make her an excellent partner for managing a household and helping with a mixed farming and blacksmith operation. He made inquiries, learned that Alice was unmarried, and that her father was open to offers. The merchant's family would have been above Thomas's station before the plague, but the economic disruptions had changed calculations about suitable matches. Thomas had land and a trade and prospects, which made him a better prospect than many young men, and after some negotiation, primarily about the dowry Alice would bring and what Thomas could offer in return, they reached an agreement. Thomas and Alice were married in the spring of 1353 in a ceremony at the parish church attended by friends and workers and neighbors from the area around Thomas's farm. It was a smaller wedding than either family would have expected before the plague, but it was genuine and warm, celebrated by people who understood they were living in changed times and who were trying to build new lives from the fragments of what had been destroyed. Alice proved to be everything Thomas had hoped for: capable and hard-working, quick to learn the rhythms of farm life, skilled at managing the household and the kitchen garden, comfortable with the mix of farm labor and domestic work that defined her days. She also brought useful commercial skills from her merchant family background, took over the accounting and record-keeping that Thomas had been managing haphazardly, organized their finances in ways that gave them both a clearer picture of their economic situation. Together they built the farm into a genuinely prosperous operation. They expanded the cultivated acreage, increased the sheep flock, improved the house and added outbuildings, established the property as one of the most productive in the manor. Thomas's blacksmith work continued to provide supplementary income, and Alice developed a side business selling eggs and cheese at market, adding to their cash income in ways that compounded over time. They had children: a son born in 1354, a daughter in 1356, another son in 1358. The children grew up on the farm, learning both agricultural skills and metalworking, receiving a mixed education that prepared them for the kind of diversified economic lives that their parents were modeling. Thomas and Alice were conscious of giving their children opportunities they themselves hadn't had, of using their improved position to create even better possibilities for the next generation. But the wider social and legal transformation that Thomas's individual success exemplified was not proceeding smoothly or without resistance. The English Crown and Parliament continued to try to reassert control over labor and wages, to reverse the social mobility that the plague had triggered, to restore something like the old feudal order, where workers were bound to land and lords exercised traditional authority. In 1361, Parliament passed another revision to the labor laws, this one even more restrictive than the previous versions. It required all able-bodied persons under 60 to work, prohibited workers from leaving their employment without permission, mandated maximum wages for various trades, and established harsh penalties for violations, including imprisonment and branding for repeat offenders. The law was a direct response to the fact that workers continued to demand higher wages and move freely in search of better conditions despite the earlier statutes, and it represented the landed class's determination to use legal coercion to restore their economic advantages. But enforcement remained inconsistent and largely ineffective against the fundamental economic realities. Justices appointed to enforce the labor laws often had their own labor shortages and were reluctant to punish workers too harshly for fear of driving them away entirely. Workers developed strategies for evading the laws, moving frequently, using intermediaries, working in areas where enforcement was lax, appealing to competing authorities who might offer protection in exchange for service. Thomas watched these legal struggles with interest, understanding that his own prosperity existed in the space between the old laws that tried to restrict mobility and the new economic realities that demanded flexibility. His land tenure was secure. He had a written contract that specified his rights and obligations, that protected him from arbitrary changes in terms, that gave him legal standing he could defend if necessary. But he also knew men who'd been prosecuted under the labor laws for demanding high wages or for moving to new employers, who'd been fined or imprisoned or forced back to their home manors against their will. The key distinction Thomas came to understand was between landed people and landless people. Once you had land tenure, once you had property, you had legal standing and economic security that protected you from the worst enforcement of the labor laws. The laws targeted mobile workers, people moving from place to place seeking wages, people without the security of property. Land ownership or secure tenancy created a buffer, gave you a position in the social hierarchy that commanded respect and legal protection. This understanding shaped Thomas's advice to his sons as they grew older. "Get land," he told them repeatedly. "However you can, whenever you can, get land, or get a skill so valuable that you can demand land as part of your compensation. Land is security. Land is freedom. Land is the difference between being subject to others' arbitrary power and having some control over your own life." By the 1370s, Thomas was in his 40s, well established, prosperous in ways that would have been unimaginable when he was young. His eldest son, also named Thomas, had taken over much of the farm work and most of the blacksmith business, allowing Thomas Sr. to step back slightly to take on more of an advisory and management role. His daughter had married a farmer from a neighboring manor, bringing a useful alliance and connections that helped both families. His younger son was training as a clerk, learning to read and write and keep accounts, preparing for administrative work that could provide income and status. The farm that Thomas had taken up in 1352 with such uncertainty was now firmly established, productive, valuable. If Thomas chose to exercise his right to purchase the land outright, the right that had been granted in his original contract, he could do so, could transform himself from tenant to freeholder, could establish his family's claim to this property in perpetuity. He'd been saving for this possibility, accumulating the purchase price carefully over the years, and he was nearly ready to make the transaction. But before he could finalize the purchase, events in the wider world intruded. In 1377, King Edward III died after a long reign, and the succession passed to his grandson, Richard II, a boy of 10. The new king's minority created political instability, and the Regency government, desperate for revenue to fund ongoing wars with France, imposed new taxes that fell heavily on common people. The most controversial was the poll tax of 1380, a flat tax levied on every person over 15 years old, regardless of their wealth or status. Previous taxes had been assessed on property or income, falling more heavily on the wealthy. But the poll tax was regressive, demanded the same payment from poor laborers as from prosperous farmers like Thomas, and it was deeply resented by people who felt they were being punished for surviving the plague, being asked to pay for a government that protected landed interests while trying to restrict the social mobility that workers had gained. Thomas paid his poll tax, 3 groats, for himself and his wife and each of his children, old enough to be assessed, grumbling but accepting it as the price of maintaining his position and security. But he noticed widespread resistance, noticed people refusing to pay or falsifying records to reduce their assessment, noticed a growing anger at the combination of high taxes and restrictive labor laws that seemed designed to extract wealth from working people while denying them the benefits of their increased bargaining power. The anger exploded in June of 1381 in what became known as the Peasants' Revolt. Starting in Kent and Essex, spreading rapidly across southeastern England, the rebellion brought together a diverse coalition of people who were frustrated with taxes and labor laws and the Government's attempts to restore feudal restrictions. Rebels attacked tax collectors and government officials, burned court records and manorial documents, demanded the abolition of serfdom and the labor laws, called for social reforms that would have fundamentally transformed English society. The revolt reached its peak when rebels entered London, met with the young King Richard II, presented their demands for social change. The king, whether sincerely or tactically, agreed to their demands, promised charters abolishing serfdom and establishing new rights. But once the rebels dispersed, trusting in these promises, the government reversed course, arrested and executed the rebellion's leaders, declared the charters invalid, and used military force to suppress any continued resistance. Thomas followed these events from Somerset, which was touched by the rebellion, but not as centrally involved as the southeastern counties. He understood the rebels' frustrations, shared many of their grievances, but he was also wary of the chaos and violence that the rebellion had unleashed. He'd built his prosperity within the existing system through careful work and legal contracts and gradual accumulation. He wanted reforms, wanted the labor laws abolished or at least not enforced, wanted lower taxes, wanted security of land tenure. But he didn't want revolution, didn't want to risk losing what he'd gained in pursuit of a more just system that might never materialize. This ambivalence was common among people in Thomas's position, prosperous enough to have something to lose, recently risen enough to remember being at the bottom, frustrated with restrictions, but not desperate enough to risk everything on rebellion. They were the beneficiaries of the changes the plague had triggered, but they wanted those changes consolidated and made secure rather than pushed further through violent upheaval. The rebellion's failure and the government's harsh repression created a complicated legacy. The immediate demands were rejected. The labor laws remained on the books. The poll tax was eventually repealed, but only after causing enormous resentment. But the rebellion also demonstrated the limits of the government's power, showed that workers couldn't be easily forced back into the old feudal arrangements, proved that the social changes triggered by the plague were too deep to be reversed by legal coercion alone. In the aftermath, a kind of practical accommodation emerged. The labor laws remained technically in force, but were enforced sporadically and often ineffectively. Workers continued to move and demand high wages, but they did so carefully, avoiding the most blatant violations, maintaining some pretense of respecting the legal restrictions. Lords continued trying to extract maximum value from their properties, but they increasingly did so through economic negotiation rather than feudal compulsion, offering better terms to attract and retain workers, accepting that the old system of unfree labor and arbitrary authority was genuinely finished. Thomas navigated this evolving system successfully, completed the purchase of his 40 acres in 1383, transforming himself from tenant to freeholder, establishing his family's claim to the land in perpetuity. The purchase price, while substantial, was less than the land's actual value because the contract had fixed it years earlier, and land values had risen as the post-plague economy stabilized. Thomas was now a landowner, a freeholder, someone with property rights that were protected by law and custom, someone who'd risen from blacksmith's son to landed farmer in a single generation through a combination of skill, hard work, and the opportunities that demographic catastrophe had created. He was in his mid-50s now, successful beyond anything he could have imagined in his youth, head of a family that was established and prospering. When he looked back on his life, on the journey from propertyless blacksmith's son to landholding farmer. He understood that he'd been extraordinarily fortunate, that he'd benefited from opportunities that most people in most times didn't have access to. But he also understood that his personal success was part of a larger pattern, that thousands of people across England had experienced similar rises, had moved from unfree or marginal status to secure land tenure, had claimed spaces in the social order that hadn't existed for their parents. The plague had been catastrophic, but it had also been transformative, had shattered old hierarchies and created room for social mobility that was reshaping English society in fundamental ways. These changes weren't always acknowledged or celebrated by those who benefited from them. Thomas knew men who'd risen as he had, but who spoke of the old days as better, who idealized a pre-plague world that had actually offered them nothing, who were uncomfortable with the social fluidity and change that had enabled their own advancement. This nostalgia puzzled Thomas. Why would you long for a system that had kept you subordinate and without prospects? But he came to understand that rapid social change created anxiety even among its beneficiaries, that people wanted stability and wanted to feel that their positions were secure and legitimate, rather than contingent and potentially reversible. The old feudal order had been oppressive, but it had also been stable, predictable, had given everyone a fixed place, even if that place was subordinate. The new order was more open, but also more uncertain, offered more opportunities, but fewer guarantees, created possibilities for advancement, but also for failure and decline. Thomas's children, growing up in this more fluid world, had different attitudes than their father. They took for granted the security and prosperity that Thomas had fought to create, didn't carry the same memories of limitation and subordination that shaped Thomas's understanding of how fortunate he'd been. His eldest son expected to inherit the farm and assume he'd continue prospering. His daughter had married expecting a comfortable life with economic security. His younger son pursued clerical training with the assumption that education and skill would lead to good positions and steady advancement. These expectations weren't arrogant exactly, but they reflected a different relationship to social hierarchy than Thomas's generation had. For Thomas, advancement had been a gift, an unexpected opportunity created by catastrophe. For his children, advancement was normal, expected, something you achieved through ability and effort rather than something granted by extraordinary circumstances. This generational difference became clear to Thomas one evening when he was talking with his eldest son about the farm's future. Thomas had been reminiscing about the early days, about how uncertain everything had been. How remarkable it was that a blacksmith's son had been able to acquire 40 acres of good land. But why shouldn't you have been able to? His son asked, genuinely puzzled. You had skills, you were willing to work hard, you had money saved. Why wouldn't that qualify you for land? Because in the old system, before the plague, it wouldn't have mattered how skilled I was or how hard I worked, Thomas explained. Land was controlled by birth, by inheritance, by feudal relationships. There was no mechanism for someone in my position to acquire land, no possibility of advancement regardless of ability or effort. The plague changed that by creating labor shortages that forced lords to offer better terms. But it wasn't natural or inevitable, it was the result of catastrophe. His son absorbed this, seemed to understand intellectually, but Thomas could see that he didn't really grasp it emotionally, couldn't fully imagine a world where ability and effort didn't lead to advancement, where your birth determined your possibilities so completely. That world was gone, had been destroyed by the plague, and by the economic and social changes that had followed, and the next generation simply assumed the more fluid social order as normal. This was probably healthy, Thomas reflected. You didn't want your children to carry your traumas, your limitations, your memories of subordination. You wanted them to grow up confident, expecting opportunities, ready to make the most of possibilities that you'd helped create for them. The fact that his son couldn't quite imagine the rigid hierarchies of the pre-plague world was evidence that those hierarchies were genuinely weakening, that the social transformation was real and lasting. As Thomas aged into his 60s and eventually his 70s, he watched these transformations continue to unfold. The labor laws remained on the books, but became increasingly irrelevant as they were simply ignored in practice. Wages for skilled workers remained high, reflecting the ongoing labor shortage that persisted decades after the plague. Social mobility continued as people used education and economic success to claim positions that had been closed to their parents. The feudal system didn't disappear entirely. Lords still existed. Manors still operated. Traditional hierarchies still shaped some aspects of life. But the system had been fundamentally altered, had become more contractual and less coercive, more based on economic negotiation and less on inherited status, more open to ability and less determined by birth. Thomas's own family exemplified these changes. His eldest son successfully managed the farm, maintained its prosperity, passed it to his own children. His daughter's marriage created useful alliances, and her children received educations that prepared them for commercial and professional careers. His younger son's clerical training led to a position in church administration, and eventually to more senior roles that brought income and status that would have been unthinkable for a blacksmith's grandson in the old system. By the time Thomas died in 1401, at the age of 73, he'd lived through the plague, the social transformation it triggered, the legal struggles over labor and land, the peasants' revolt and its aftermath, and the gradual consolidation of a new social order that was more fluid and more based on economic performance than the feudal world he'd been born into. He'd witnessed the transformation from a society where birth determined fate to one where ability and effort and luck could lead to real advancement. He was buried in the churchyard of his parish church, with a marker that identified him as Thomas Ashford, freeholder, a designation that marked his status and achievement. At his funeral, his children and grandchildren gathered, a substantial family that was prosperous and rising, that had opportunities their ancestor couldn't have imagined when he'd been a young blacksmith's son with no prospects beyond wage labor. One of his grandsons, speaking at the funeral, tried to articulate what Thomas's life had meant, what he'd accomplished and represented. "My grandfather lived through the great dying," the young man said, "and he didn't just survive, he built. He took the terrible opportunities that catastrophe created, and he made something of them. He acquired land, established our family, created security that we now inherit. He worked within changing laws and changing times, adapted when necessary, stood firm when possible, always focused on building something lasting that would outlive him. The world he was born into was rigid and limited, offered people like him nothing. The world he died in was more open, more based on merit, more willing to reward hard work and skill. He didn't create those changes the plague and its aftermath created them, but he recognized them, seized them, made the most of them. And we're all here because he did, all benefiting from the foundation he built. This eulogy captured something true about Thomas's life, but it also simplified the story in ways that Thomas himself might have complicated. Yes, he'd seized opportunities, but those opportunities had come from catastrophe, from the deaths of millions of people, from the suffering and loss that had devastated society. His advancement had been built on the emptied land and vacant positions that the plague had created. This didn't make his achievement less real, but it did mean that his success was inseparable from others' suffering, that his social mobility was enabled by social catastrophe. Thomas had understood this, had never been entirely comfortable with the fact that his prosperity came from plague deaths, had sometimes wondered whether he was somehow profiting from evil, whether his advancement was morally compromised by its origins in disaster. But he'd also recognized that the plague had happened regardless of anyone's wishes, that the deaths and the changes they triggered were simply facts that survivors had to navigate, that choosing to benefit from new opportunities didn't make you responsible for the catastrophe that created them. This moral complexity was part of the legacy Thomas left, part of what his life illustrated about social transformation and individual agency and the relationship between catastrophe and opportunity. The plague had been evil, had caused suffering on a scale that was almost incomprehensible, but it had also shattered a social system that had been oppressive in its own ways, had created possibilities for people who'd been without them, had forced changes that made society more fluid, and arguably more just, even though those changes came at a terrible cost. Thomas's story, and thousands of stories like it across England and Europe, showed how individual lives were shaped by these large historical forces, how personal decisions and adaptations accumulated into social transformation, how new laws and new lives emerged from the ruins of old systems that catastrophe had destroyed. The England of 1401, when Thomas died, was fundamentally different from the England of 1348, when he'd been a young man with no prospects. The labor laws that had tried to freeze wages and restrict mobility remained on the books, but were largely dead letters, ignored in practice by both workers and employers who'd settled into new patterns of economic negotiation. Land tenure had shifted from primarily feudal and unfree arrangements to increasingly contractual and commercial relationships. Social mobility had increased dramatically, with ability and education and economic success, creating opportunities for advancement that birth alone no longer determined. These changes hadn't happened smoothly or without resistance. The Crown and Parliament and landed lords had fought them, had tried repeatedly to restore old hierarchies and old forms of control. The peasants' revolt had erupted when the tension between old laws and new realities became unbearable. The process of transformation had been marked by conflict and violence and legal struggles that continued for decades. But the fundamental direction was clear: toward a more commercial economy, toward more contractual social relationships, toward more mobility and fluidity and opportunity for people willing and able to seize them. The feudal world was dying, slowly and unevenly, but genuinely, and something new was emerging from its ruins. Thomas Ashford's life, from blacksmith's son to landholding farmer, was one thread in this larger tapestry of transformation. He hadn't caused the changes, hadn't led rebellions or written new laws or consciously worked to transform society. He'd simply been a practical man who recognized opportunity, who worked hard, who made careful decisions, who built security for himself and his family using the tools and possibilities that his historical moment provided. But in doing so, in making those individual choices and living that individual life, he'd participated in social transformation, had been one of thousands of people whose accumulated decisions and actions created the new social order that emerged from the plague's aftermath. His new life, made possible by new laws and new economic realities, had helped create the world that his children and grandchildren would inherit. A world where blacksmiths' sons could become landholders, where ability could lead to advancement, where the rigid hierarchies of the feudal past were being replaced by the more fluid social structures of the early modern future. This was the story of Thomas Ashford, and it was also the story of his generation, the story of how societies transform, how catastrophe creates opportunity, how new laws enable new lives, how individual stories accumulate into historical change that reshapes the world for generations to come. The plague had killed millions, but the survivors had built from the ruins, had created new social arrangements, had established patterns that would persist long after they were gone, had transformed English society in ways that would influence the nation's development for centuries. The new laws had enabled new lives. Thomas's life proved it, and the lives of his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all benefiting from the foundation he'd built, all living in a more open and fluid social world than he'd been born into, all carried forward the transformation that he'd participated in and exemplified, all bore witness to the truth that catastrophe and opportunity, suffering and advancement, the destruction of old orders, and the creation of new ones were all woven together in the complex tapestry of human history, always changing, always transforming, always creating new possibilities from the ruins of old certainties.